So thank you for the introduction and for inviting us. I'm Shachar. I'm a PhD student at the Hebrew U. My research field is NLP and interaction in particular, mostly between humans and models, but I also tend to take inspiration from humans to humans interactions. And I didn't have the chance yet, but I also hope to expand it to models to models interaction as well. And yeah, Leshem is here too. And this is a joint work also with Omri, my advisor. And let's start. Okay. So human feedback is useful for model training, and some would say that it is even crucial for model training. And we can take the human feedback and use it to better align the models to the user preferences. So for example, if we have multiple responses for the same user query and the human annotation that tells us which is the best one, we can teach the model to generate more responses that are similar to the better response. The problem is that this is costly, because in order to obtain the human feedback annotation, we need human annotators. And there are other problems we can think of, like, for example, the lack of diversity among the human annotators or the lack of expertise for some special domains. So there are some alternatives. Among them, we can find LLM as a judge, where we replace the human annotator with an LLM and ask it to rate or score the responses instead of the human annotator. And another approach would be to pick a good model and a bad model and assume that all the outputs of the better model would be better than the outputs of the bad models, and that would be our annotations. So the problem with these approaches is, of course, the bias. We know, for example, that LLMs prefer their own output, or that they prefer longer outputs regardless of their content. And as I said in the introduction, I tend to take inspiration from human-to-human interactions. And in our case, we know that when humans talk to each other, they do not score each other's responses or use thumbs up to let their partner know that they're satisfied. Instead, they infer it all from the communication itself. So humans actively signal their agreement and understanding with verbal and visual responses. And here we would want to ask, would we see something similar in human to model interaction? So the short answer to this question is yes. We do see a lot of cases of what we call naturally occurring feedback. For example, the user thanks the model and tell it that it is wrong, explaining what it wanted to get from it instead. But let's go step by step. We start by defining a feedback taxonomy. There is a previous great work by Petrarch et al. In which the author suggested both an error taxonomy and a matching feedback taxonomy. And then they manually annotated multiple datasets according to them. So out of the 5 feedback categories that they suggested, we adopt 4. We have repeat or rephrase for cases when the user asks again the same question or like change the wording a bit. We have make aware with correction for cases when the user tells the model that it is wrong and why. We have make aware without correction, which is the same, but without the correction part. And we have asked for clarification for cases when the user needs to ask again something to clarify the previous answer. On top of that, we added a positive feedback category for all the cases when the user is satisfied and thank the model or tell it that it was right. And I also want to note that in the taxonomy of Petrek et al., they had like another category, ignored continue, for cases when there is an error, but the user doesn't provide any feedback for it. So in our case, when we don't have any error annotation, this is not relevant. It just would be no feedback. We want the feedback to be anchored in the user's response. We don't want it to be a general estimation of whether the user was satisfied or not, because that may be a source of bias. And this is like where we started. So we require that a feedback case will be a span of text within one of the user responses, and that it will be classified into one of our categories. So let's take a look in this example. The user asks a technical question. The model responds. The user then tells it this is not what you wanted. And that would be a case of make error with correction feedback. No, I don't want to control visibility. I want to switch places. The model then adjusts its answer, and the user then tells that this last response is good. Good, it works. So this would be a positive feedback. We manually annotate about 300 chats from the LMSys dataset. The LMSys dataset is a huge one, with 1 million user-to-model interactions with no annotations. And the models there are diverse, both open and closed ones. And annotating a single conversation took us about 5 minutes, depending whether there is a feedback case in it or not. So whether we need to like mark the specific span and decide which category it belongs to. And we find that 30% of the conversation do contain feedback, which is a lot. And this is like a very encouraging result. We then look at another conversation dataset, the self-feeding chatbot dataset from 5 years ago. And we find 50% less feedback cases in this older dataset. So for this dataset, we have also errors annotation. So let me assure you, this is not like a lake of errors that made this lake of feedback cases. So what is the reason? We think that we see more feedback in the newer dataset because newer models allow a more human-like conversation. So in turn, we also have more feedback from the users, like they have in like human-to-human conversations. And therefore, we expect that in the future, we will see even more cases of naturally accurate feedback in human-to-model conversation. And for example, you can think of voice assistants, let's say. Personally, I can say that I tend to thank voice assistants more than I thank textual chatbots. So like this is the intuition to that. So we know that there is human feedback. Now how can we extract it in scale? So we use Mixtral with quantization and extract it to find spans of feedback and their matching categories. And we then validate the output. And we want to make sure that the span is indeed a substring of a user response and that the category is valid, like one of our taxonomy. And I want to note that this approach is a bit naive. Like we probably could do better with better models, no quantization, or a whole different algorithm, maybe one that addresses each of the feedback categories differently. However, we will see that even this imperfect data is suffice to show an improvement. So let's take a look at some graphs. On the left, we have the confusion matrix for the extracted feedback categories. In the x-axis, we have the predicted label, and the y-axis, the true label. So we can see that there is no confusion between the positive category to the rest. And we can see also that Mixtral doesn't like the make aware without correction category at all. On the right, we have the extracted feedback distribution. So recalling the manual feedback distribution, we can see that also here the rephrase and clarify categories are the most common, and that make aware without correction and positive feedback are the rarest. And I want to note that we have a precision recall trade-off here. Because, for example, we can use a different algorithm and extract positive feedback cases on a vocabulary level only by looking for user responses that contain the words "thank you." And that would probably give us a relatively high precision, but a low recall. But if we assume that the conversations are cheap because they are conducted anyway, we should prefer the precision over the recall and just run the algorithm over an endless stream of data. The question is whether this is indeed the case. Let's say that the conversations are conducted anyway, but are they saved somewhere? So this is a short side note. Why for-profit companies collect user data through their APIs and use it to internally improve their own models. The open source community don't have such a thing. And for that, we made the Sherlem plugin, and you can check it out in the link here. But for now, let's go back to naturally occurring feedback. So to get a better feeling of the data, let's take a look at false positive example. The user here tells the model she wants to know how it works. The model then responds in a very model-like manner. I am an AI language model that uses machine learning algorithms to understand and generate blah, blah, blah. And the user then asks, can I make you on my own computer? The automatic method marked this as a feedback case, while our human annotators didn't. We don't consider it to be a clarification question, but rather a new question asking for new information. we do ever see why this could be confusing. And therefore, it is possible that this does hold some relevant signal after all. We use our method to extract a lot of feedback examples. We run it over like the whole NMC's dataset, and we list it as a dataset. And you are welcome to take a look at it. And no worries, I have like another slide with all the links at the end. Okay. So we want to demonstrate the usefulness of our collected data. We start by using the positive feedback cases only in a fine-tuning settings. We fine-tune 3 models in increasing sizes. We have Pythia 1.4b, Pythia 2.8b, and Mistral 7b. We use the validation split of the Open Assistant dataset. And we use both our fine-tuned models and their corresponding pre-trained versions to generate the last response again. To determine which response is the best, we use 3 approaches. First, we perform a human evaluation, asking a human annotator to say which responses they prefer. Of course, the annotator doesn't know what model created which response, and we like flip the order of the responses between the examples. And also we have open models evaluation, where we use top models from the reward bench leaderboard to score each response, and then we pick the one with the highest score. And finally, we also do a GPT-4 evaluation, similar to the human evaluation, asking it which response is the best. So here we have the win rate results. So for example, here in the human evaluation for Pythia 1.4b, we know that the fine-tuned model was better than its pre-trained version in 69% of the cases, according to the human annotators. And we can see that the numbers are pretty much consistent, except maybe for the open models evaluation, for the smaller ones, like the 1.4b and 2.8b, where we think this is because of the open models and sensitivity to the data distribution. Unlike GPT-4, they were trained specifically for the task of scoring responses, and probably mostly on data that came from larger and better models. So when we show them the outputs of the smaller models, they just don't know how to handle it. But if we put the smaller models aside, we can see that for the 7B model, they are doing similar to GPT-4 or the human evaluation. So to sum up, we see a consistent and significant improvement over the pre-trained model. And the improvement for the larger model is usually the largest. We test another baseline, a stronger one, and we train on non-filtered chat data. So this is actually a distillation. Like we take the 7B model and we train it on outputs of other stronger models' chats without picking the chats with the positive feedback like we did before, just random chats. So we get here a win rate of 75%, which is indeed an improvement over the pre-trained, but still not as good as training on our data, which resulted with win rate of 78%. We also ran an initial experiment of preference training. We use KTO, which is very similar to DPO, but it doesn't require the data samples to be organized as positive and negative pairs. So this is like better for our scenario. And working with this algorithm wasn't easy, like in terms of hyperparameter, etc. And we chose to limit our efforts eventually, but still we did manage to improve the fine-tuned model in one point, which is a start, but there is more job here. To summarize, we saw that natural feedback commonly occurs. We saw that prevalence increases with newer models, and we suggested an automatic method to extract it in scale. And finally, we used this extracted data to train and improve existing models. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. That was fascinating. There's so much to talk about on this paper. I've got a few questions, but I'll throw over to Elena. I know she's been looking at the questions. And I know Leshem has been answering some in the chat. So if there's any here that we want to go to, let's see what we got. Oh yeah, I'll unmute you again, Leshem. Okay.
So one point that came up in comments, which was interesting, is how this kind of data, it seems that it would give X and Meta a big advantage. That's from Will Johnston. There's a thread on that. That's a mini thread, but maybe that's worthwhile an answer.
Yeah, Leshem, if you want to chime in there, that's yeah, great.
So in essence, it gives anyone that has a lot of chats advantage. So maybe OpenAI is behind the scenes collecting all of the chats that we ever had, and they can run now in retrospect and improve the models. So in that essence, it gives some companies a lot of advantage. But in another essence, all of this, even like this, like us doing those things came from trying to give open resources an advantage. And the advantage that we have there is that instead of giving feedback on everything manually, now the only burden that is required from the open to get feedback is to share the chats. So the chats that you already have with models, you only need to share it with the world, and it suddenly is both text and your impression over the responses from the model. Yeah, I can elaborate more, but I think let's give more questions.
One of the things I was thinking about as I was reading this, and again, I'm coming from more of a social sciences perspective, but in linguistic anthropology and in sociolinguistics, there's an entire subfield called conversation analysis, which is, of course, the analysis of the kind of turn-taking structure of conversation. And there's an argument in that field which essentially suggests that if somebody says anything or interacts in any way, that's feedback, right? The idea that the entire thing is a feedback loop. And that even the fact, like, so your example was really interesting. Can I make you on my own computer? And I understand that that didn't kind of cleanly fit into one of the 5 categories. But of course, it is a kind of feedback in that because the user felt that they could now ask another question, they were perhaps satisfied or at least prompted by the answer to the first question to ask another. So that is in essence a kind of positive feedback as well. So I wonder if there's like, how did those 5 categories, I think you mentioned Petrak et al. 2023, is there any kind of theory underlying those 5 categories? Like, how were they chosen? And can you imagine, I'm kind of leading up also to a question by Abi here, thoughts on tracking other types of feedback, like clicks, time spent, or Elena mentioned up in the thread somewhere, even eventually you can imagine multimodal kinds of feedbacks like nodding or shaking your head or smiling or things like that. So yeah, thoughts on the taxonomy of feedback and what some more work could be done on that.
Do you wanna start and I'll continue?
Yeah. So first, like, yeah, there are lots of we called it in the paper implicit feedback cases that we are ignoring like here in these settings, and we chose like to focus on the more explicit ones of that. But of course, we like there are other cases that could be useful. And also like the feedback categories, here what we had in mind is like what could we do like in the next steps with these kinds of feedback categories. Like maybe we can handle each category differently when we train and improve the model. So let's say, for example, maybe the rephrase and repeat category could be used for preference training. But the make error with correction category could be used for like training the model to, like, we also have the, like maybe the solution or like the way we want the model to fix its previous response.
Yeah, I'll just add that it's interesting that this is where you're coming from, because in some essence, we exactly fall in the in between. So, like I started as a more linguistic oriented, and now moving a bit less. And third, like the professor that is not here, is a lot of his interests are in the more linguistic side of NLP. So that was definitely one of the motivating factors to do those kinds of works. Yeah, and we focused on the very explicit and very easy to spot cues, because we felt those are, first of all, the least debatable. This is, like they say, thanks. It's a feedback and a positive one. It's not something you can say, yeah, maybe, there are rankings, so this should be 3 and this should be 4, so I shouldn't use both of them as just positive. No, they said, no, it's bad, thanks is good. And if they ask the same question again, then it wasn't a good, like, you didn't answer. But those would be one of the obvious next steps of adding more kinds of responses and using deeper theory to find those.
Yeah, that's excellent. It's certainly a nice crossover between the kind of sociolinguistics and NLP. We got a good question from Mark Ko on which led to a nice thread on, do we know of any models that contain training prompts that specifically request feedback on their answers, like, please let me know if that solved your problem? I imagine that would really help to create a fortuitous cycle of improvement to an LLM. Leshem, I think you were commenting on that in the thread.
Yeah, so I can even jump to the end. So ChatGPT is the only one I know that has something like that, but what it actually has is a UI. So it's not in the text, it just sometimes give you to and ask you to do it. Chatbot Arena, you can think of it like that, but it's a very different animal. People interact there only to evaluate models, so it's not natural and also not the full chat. And other than that, models do not use anything like that to become more interactive and real life and use feedback because it was not useful, right? Currently, there's a lot of this feedback and no model ever used it. We assume that as we get, like the other side of all of this work is that if we make feedback relevant, so we would get more interactive systems, and then people would interact with those models in a more natural way and tell them, I'm happy with that, I'm not happy with that, because they know they would change. And the moment they start changing, you start having a dialogue and not a classifier that you interact with multiple times.
Good question here from Ravi. The paper mentions auto-generated feedback, which is contrasted to naturalistic feedback. What would be a definition or some examples of auto-generated feedback? If you could address that.
Yeah, so it's also something we already talked about in the chat. So I would also add to that the differentiation between even what is a feedback and what is just, I don't know, data or supervision. Because I think those two terms could be confused. So one of them is you need the model to have an output and you need to react to this output before it's a feedback. Because otherwise it's just data. If I go to Reddit and I have good comments on Reddit and bad comments on Reddit, it might be very useful data, but it doesn't improve my specific model. I can't use this model and say, this is the problem that this model has, and I have a next step improving it. So that's about the feedback part. And the other is about the naturalistic part. So there are all kinds of methods that get, let's say, one or two examples and then give it back to an LLM, and you tell the LLM, give me more examples like that. And then the LLM starts having fake chats, feedback, whatever it is. So that would be the synthetic generated. So those are often, if you don't have a lot of data, those often give you more data, supposedly of the same kind. It's just a partial solution. You need the seeds to do that.
This brings up there is an interesting discussion here on what is natural anyway, like what does naturalistic mean, and would say social media posts or responses count as natural or not? And again, from the perspective of the social sciences, of course, that word natural is a loaded one, right? There, all kind of communication is informed by the norms of the genre, and that's what we're seeing emerge with interactions with chatbots, of course, right? Question here from, I just lost it. There was a question from on content. Oh, here we go. Yeah, has there been any research on things like more contentious issues for this kind of feedback, like political topics or highly subjective issues? I might throw in like moral and ethical quandaries as well. How would a model be trained to be uncertain or potentially unbiased on those topics? Really like the idea of incorporating human feedback that's just sitting there for the taking.
I think it's a good question that we are bothered with, in part because it's not really addressed. So like maybe it's a future reference, but we had another paper that we aim to present in this forum later, that discusses the open problems of open human feedback and things like that. And one of the issues that we don't discuss is like, because currently what you have is that you pay for people for this feedback. Because feedback is not something open or something that just comes naturally or something like that, a company goes and pays workers and then they tell them, they give the guidelines. So if they do not agree, then they say, okay, either the guidelines are not good enough or you're a bad worker, we throw this kind of feedback. But as you say, like, I don't know, Taiwan and China might disagree on something that both of them want a certain response, or Taiwanese people, right? Look, not that country. They are both right. They should, like, one would get one response, the other should get another response, and it's all like what they want. And the same as all of the other, like, different opinions, different moralities, different all kinds of those. So we have very initial works that we're trying to do to see how do we even find when people do not, like, that this feedback is something people do not agree on, and this feedback is something that they do agree on. What happens when you do? Like, do you split them? Do you train? You just throw it? There are all kinds of, like, what do you do with that? It's all very early. I think the only somewhat relevant works I know is that people, you said, how would you respond to it? One thing is that models, people prefer models to tell them that they're uncertain. So there have been these human-computer interaction works showing that they prefer the model to say something like, this is debatable, but I would say that, I don't know, taking COVID vaccines is very good. I don't know, something like that. And then currently it's an ability that models don't have. They can give you a response and they can give you low probability over the response, but they could not give you a different sentence that you understand from it that this is a low probability answer. Right? If they have two answers, they choose one. They don't tell you, they choose one and say low probability, but this one, instead of giving, like, I don't know how to choose between those two. Here are two options and it's debatable.
Great. I know, Elena, did you have any questions in the queue?
In the queue, there is one on performance from John. Did you see any increase in sycophancy or other effects which could degrade quality? Are there any new techniques in training, data selection, or process which helped mitigate these effects? And after that, I have my own question I will jump into.
So at least, like, Shachar, you can correct me, but I think at least for now, we didn't see too much of that. Maybe because we also didn't see people trying. Like, they didn't know that someone is going to use this feedback. They just used it as a chat and thought that it's unuseful. We can assume that the moment that people know you're using it, they'll start also hacking it. And again, all of this community moderation and governance, trying to understand how can the community decide when to ignore feedback because it's bad, or when this feedback is something in like that there are different opinions about it. Maybe both opinions are right but different. It's an open question on how to address it.
Yeah, there's a couple more comments. I see one about feedback compared to manipulation, and when one is another. And then also alternative approaches to getting feedback, say brain imaging, while interacting with the model, which I'm sure is happening. I'm not sure where it sort of belongs, probably in psychology, but every technology is available for that to be happening. So I have to assume people are doing it already. Um,
So again, doing what manipulation you're referring to?
there was a comment on from John Lazarev. When two humans interact, occasionally manipulation takes place. Definitionally, where is that line between feedback and manipulation, and to what extent we need to account for the risk of manipulation when we decide how to process feedback? I think that's quite relevant in the context of how good models are at this kind of thing from what we've seen. Lots of chat.
There's a good question here from Dexter from Chicago. Have you explored any methods around human feedback on function call / structured responses rather than plain text / language interactions?
I think it's going to be a short answer. Like, not yet. I mean, not that it's not interesting, but practically no.
Is make aware always negative feedback from Jeff?
So I think it's a make aware with correction. Shachar, you probably remember the
Yeah, make
answer.
a with correction and without correction. I think usually it does. Maybe actually they ask for clarification sometimes might be not fully like a negative feedback, because usually like some part of the answer was right. So yeah, like in this case.
Maybe give an example of the make aware. Maybe it would be easier to see why it's negative. You know, just invent one, not a real example.
Yeah, I will say just from a quick perspective of where we could be going. I don't know how many of you know, but OpenAI did a challenge about a year ago on democratic input to AI. And so this is my speculation, but it could be that we're looking at the layer of self-moderation to an extent, because right now we're completely giving, for example, Meta owns responsibility to moderate everything on the platform. Twitter, we were seeing moving in that direction in the sense of community annotations. And so I could see the future where there is more baked into platforms and products and even chat interactions where you would have some kind of democratic input. And so hopefully a way to represent more opinions than just the guidelines from that are centralized guidelines. But then, of course, for the open source AI, Leshem, maybe you can speak to that, where we don't have one product that has 100 million of users giving it feedback on its model. And so when you look at private models and compare that future where feedback is always collected to the open source AI models, where are we going to get that data from?
Yeah, so I think in some essence it's the opposite. Like we assume that we don't have one source where we have millions of people talking to, but it's exactly the assumption that OpenAI is the only way to go. We have a lot of models and people are using those. So you can go to Hugging Face chats or something, or a lot of people running on their own platform and a lot of different places. And when you talk to a model, you own the interaction. So it's something people do not, I mean, you can sign a contract and give it to someone, but in essence, when you have something creative and you have a machine in the process, even if it's, for example, a machine that generated pictures, so far, like in terms of law and things like that, the assumption is that the model did not make the creation, but you did through an aid of a computer. And in that sense, then everything we always interact with those models is our creation of chats and feedback and those kind of things. So what we really need is just somewhere where we can create, when we can pull this very diverse pool of chats and feedback and things like that from the different people and the different collaborations and the different sources where people use. It's true that we don't have one place, but it's fine that it's not all chats in a single platform. We just need to bring it to the same place, and then, yeah, like we have a lot of people using. It's more getting a lot of people to interact with something is exactly the things that the open is strong with. What is not, what the open, open source and open communities and things like that, what they're weak is money, is resources, is a large group of people doing something full time. So there are all kinds of things where a closed centralized body is better, but actually getting a lot of small interactions, like think of a Wikipedia versus Britannica kind of competition. It's clear where the resources go.
Good question from Mark here about how do you compare this natural feedback to more simple thumbs up, thumbs down feedback? Did you perform any ablation comparing the full natural feedback versus replacing the language with a more simple signal?
No, in this work, mostly like maybe the thumbs up down signal will be better, like more accurate in some cases. I think the advantage here is that like we have this kind of feedback for free. We don't need to ask the user to do something extra in order to provide it for us.
And because it's
There's another
free,
question.
also very common. Yeah, that's all. Just like,
Right.
if you don't need to work for it, you see it a lot. 1 in every 3
Right.
chats have it.
Right. A kind of a follow-on question. Is it possible to use a sentiment score of the human prompts as a heuristic to determine positive or negative labels rather than classifying into categories, or those 5 categories, say?
Yeah.
Now go.
Yeah. Maybe. One thing that we really cared about is like keeping the feedback anchored to the text, because we don't want like a sentiment model to bring us back to the LLM as a judge, where like there are some biases and other problems. So this is like why we prefer this approach. But maybe like that's also a possibility maybe for some of the categories. Yeah.
I just one last question around the idea of interaction as a kind of play, right? This is a very kind of anthropological angle, but I know a lot of the, especially in the early days, a lot of the kinds of interactions people were having with ChatGPT were playful, and the kinds of responses were not necessarily, like the kinds of feedback was not necessarily designed to elicit more or correct answers, but was just designed to explore the limits of this new machine. I know me and my kids have a lot of fun trying to get ChatGPT to dodge questions in ever more creative ways, where we just want them to make a decision on like which is the better band or what's better, cheesecake or a pecan pie, and it will never take a stance on anything, right? So a lot of that feedback is kind of in the realm of play. Is of the data you didn't consider this kind of play-based or this just kind of free form, let's see how long this interaction can go. Is there anything you can do with that data around the kinds of interactions people use to keep conversations going?
Yeah, so I think before like before even thinking that that's a different case, I think you very explicitly stated what you want. You wanted it to take a stance. The only thing is that in this very specific case, the model creator or whoever it is said, in this specific case, I want you to ignore what the users want and give it something else. But the preference there is very clear. Your preference, you gave it the preference that you want it to play with you, and it's fine, or that you want it to take a stance, or, you know, if you want to play, to have a role playing, it doesn't have to be about correctness. It's about what you want to be the good response for this input. So if it's used for storytelling and help me write stories, then sure. If you give me correct responses, what would I do with them? So it's all fine, right?
That's a great answer, the context of each interaction. That's a great answer. Okay, I'll throw back to Elena for some last words, but thanks so much, everybody, for joining us.
But anyways, speaking of feedback, this is the website, paperclub.aitinkers.org. If you come down to the bottom, there's a contact, and that'll send email right to Elena and I. So if you have suggestions for papers that you'd like to see covered, or you're connected to researchers that have done incredible work that really should be reaching this audience, please go there and click that and nominate, suggest, or give any input or feedback that you have at all. Thank you.